The Chinese mafia boss's baby wouldn't stop crying on the plane until a single mother did the unthinkable. The infant's screams tore through the first-class cabin like shattered porcelain, relentless and soul-piercing. Every passenger within earshot flinched, clutched their armrests, or cast nervous glances toward the source of the disturbance. But none dared to complain. Not when they saw the man holding the child. Guang Ko sat motionless in his seat, his jaw locked so tight it could splinter bone. The immaculately tailored charcoal suit that normally made him look like a living weapon now seemed to suffocate him like a noose. His normally lethal, calculating eyes held a flicker of something forbidden in his world. Desperation. Raw, unmasked desperation. The baby, his daughter, continued to wail, tiny fists beating against his broad chest. 10 weeks old and already bearing the weight of a dynasty she didn't ask for. 10 weeks since Li Hua had taken her last breath in a hail of bullets meant for him, dying moments after bringing this child into the world. 10 weeks since Guang Ko, the dragon head whose name made entire governments negotiate in whispers, had become something he never thought possible. Powerless. Boss. One of his bodyguards leaned in carefully, speaking in Mandarin low enough that other passengers couldn't hear. We could divert to Tianjin. Find a doctor. No. Guang Ko's voice was still wrapped in silk-covered steel. We maintain course. But the baby didn't care about maintaining course. She didn't care that her father controlled criminal networks spanning from Hong Kong to Singapore. That police commissioners crossed the street to avoid his shadow. That entire families had vanished at his word. The infant only knew hunger, agony, and the absence of the warmth she'd known for 10 precious weeks before it was ripped away. Guang Ko had tried everything. Bottles prepared by the nurse who waited in Beijing. Formula imported from Switzerland. Pacifiers that the child spat out with surprising fury. Rocking motions that felt clumsy in arms more accustomed to breaking necks than soothing cries. Nothing worked. For rows behind, Xiaochen heard the desperate cries and felt her body betray her grief instinctively. Her breasts ached with sympathetic letdown, milk threatening to soak through the nursing pads she still wore despite the fact that she closed her eyes, forcing down the tsunami of grief that always came with that thought. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since she'd held her own son. 3 weeks since the tiny heart had simply stopped beating in the night with no warning, no mercy. Sudden infant death syndrome, the doctors had said, as if putting a clinical name to the nightmare made it hurt less. Xiaochen had been heading to Beijing from a grief support group in Shanghai, trying to gather the shattered pieces of her life. She was a pediatric nurse, or at least she had been. After losing Liang, she couldn't bring herself to return to the hospital, couldn't watch other people's babies thrive while hers lay cold beneath the earth. The crying intensified, escalating to a pitch that spoke of genuine suffering, and Xiaochen felt tears burn her own eyes. She knew that sound, the desperate, primal wail of an infant who needed something beyond bottles and formulas, something only a mother's body could provide. Her hands trembled as she gripped the armrests. "Miss, are you all right?" The flight attendant paused beside her, concerned. Xiaochen looked up, then back toward where the crying originated. "That baby, he sounds," she caught herself. "I'm a nurse. A pediatric nurse. Maybe I can help." The attendant's expression shifted to something between relief and trepidation. "The passenger has been quite firm about refusing assistance. But if you'd like to try, I suppose it couldn't hurt." Xiaochen unbuckled her seatbelt before rationality could stop her, following the attendant down the aisle. With each step, her heart hammered harder. This was madness. She was still lactating, her body stubbornly refusing to accept that there was no longer a baby to feed. But she couldn't just offer to breastfeed a stranger's child, could she? Then she saw him. Guang Ko sat like an emperor on a throne, even in desperation. Jet black hair swept back from a face that looked carved from jade by an unforgiving master, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw darkened by precisely maintained stubble, and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. A dragon tattoo coiled up from beneath his collar, disappearing into the sleeve of his suit. He wore authority like a second skin, and violence emanated from him in waves that made her survival instinct scream to turn around. But the baby in his arms looked so impossibly small, so vulnerable against that battle-hardened chest. The infant's face was crimson from crying, delicate features twisted in agony. "Sir," the flight attendant began nervously, her voice trembling slightly. "This passenger is a nurse." She wondered if she might. Guang Keo's gaze snapped to Xiaochen, and she felt the impact like a blade against her throat. Those eyes could dissect souls, could make hardened criminals confess to crimes they'd never committed. For a heartbeat, Xiaochen forgot how to breathe. "A nurse," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous like thunder before a storm. An accent threaded through the Mandarin, Cantonese undertones, probably from his years controlling Hong Kong's underworld. "Pediatric," Xiaochen heard herself say, though her voice sounded distant, dreamlike. I know that cry. She's hungry. I've tried the bottle." Frustration fractured through Guang Keo's iron control. "She refuses it." Xiaochen's eyes moved from the man to the baby, and something in her chest split wide open. The infant's cries had taken on a desperate, guttural edge, the kind that spoke of genuine suffering. She'd heard it too many times in the NICU, and her body responded before her mind could intervene. "Some babies won't take artificial nipples," she said softly, stepping closer despite every nerve screaming at her to flee from this lethal man. Especially if they were breastfed initially. Was her mother. Something shifted in Guang Keo's expression. A flash of such visceral anguish that Xiaochen's breath caught in her throat. "She died," he said flatly, each word carved from stone. 10 weeks ago. Killed protecting him." The cabin seemed to fall silent around them, though the baby still wailed. Xiaochen's eyes burned with unshed tears, her grief recognizing his even as her nurse's training engaged. "Then she's probably refusing the bottle because she's searching for something familiar," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something she associates with safety and survival." Their eyes locked, and Xiaochen saw the exact moment he understood what she was implying. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the stubble, and for a second she thought he might order his guards to remove her. But then the baby let out another heart-wrenching wail, and something in the untouchable dragon head fractured. "Are you offering what I think you're offering?" His voice was dangerous, testing, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Xiaochen swallowed hard. This was insane. This was beyond insane. But the baby was dying. And her body was producing milk that had nowhere to go, milk that ached to fulfill its purpose. And maybe, just maybe, she could save this tiny life even though she'd failed to save her own. "I'm still producing," she admitted, her cheeks flushing with heat. "I lost my son 3 weeks ago." "My body hasn't," her voice cracked. "My body doesn't understand that he's gone." The air between them crackled with unspoken understanding. Two strangers united by impossible loss, by grief that had no language, by the desperate cry of a baby who needed what only one of them could provide. Guang Ko studied her face for what felt like an eternity. She could see him calculating, weighing risks, considering implications she couldn't begin to understand. Then his eyes dropped to his daughter, whose cries had become hoarse, weakening. When he looked back at Xiaochen, something in his expression had shifted. Not softened, this man would never be soft, but opened. Just a crack. "Sit," he commanded quietly, his voice rough with emotions he clearly didn't know how to name. And Xiaochen, the pediatric nurse who had buried her son 3 weeks ago, who had sworn she'd never hold another baby again, sat down beside the most dangerous man in Asia. She didn't know it yet, but that single act of compassion had just invoked an ancient triad blood law. She didn't know that in the eyes of the criminal underworld, she had just become the dragon mother. She didn't know that by saving this baby's life, she had marked herself as the most valuable target in Southeast Asia. All she knew was the weight of the infant being carefully placed in her arms, the desperate way the baby immediately rooted toward her chest, and the feeling, for the first time in 3 weeks, that maybe her broken heart could still beat for a purpose. Behind them, Guang Kao's bodyguards exchanged loaded glances. They understood what had just happened, even if the woman didn't. The dragon head's heir had been fed by a stranger. By ancient law, that made her family. And in their world, family was bound not just by blood, but by death itself. Guang Ko had faced death more times than he could count. Bullets, blades, poison, he'd survived them all with nothing but ice in his veins and calculation in his mind. But this tiny, wailing creature in his arms was destroying him in ways no enemy ever could. May's screams had been continuous for the past 40 minutes. Not the normal fussing of an infant, but something primal and desperate that made even his most hardened bodyguards shift uncomfortably in their seats. Her face had gone from pink to red to an alarming purple, tiny fists flailing against his chest, as if she could physically fight away the hunger consuming her. "Boss, please." Chen Wei, his second in command, leaned across the aisle with another bottle. "The warmed formula, maybe if we try again." "She won't take it." Guang Kao's voice was hollow, stripped of its usual command. He'd watched his daughter reject 7 different bottles in the past 2 hours. She'd take the nipple into her mouth, suck once or twice, then spit it out and scream louder, as if offended by the substitution. The nanny in Beijing had assured him this formula was identical to what Li Hua had supplemented with. The pediatrician had said the transition should be seamless. They were all wrong. Or perhaps Mei simply knew that her mother was gone. Knew that nothing would ever be the same. Guang Ko adjusted his hold, trying to replicate the way he'd seen Li Hua cradle their daughter. But his arms that had snapped necks and crushed windpipes, felt clumsy, inadequate. The expensive suit jacket that usually armored him now felt like a straitjacket, constricting his chest until he could barely breathe. Around them, first-class passengers pretended not to stare. An elderly businessman buried his face deeper in his newspaper. A young couple whispered to each other, casting nervous glances. A flight attendant hovered nearby, clearly wanting to help but too frightened to approach. They all recognized him, of course. Or at least recognized the aura of violence that clung to him like smoke. The 2 bodyguards flanking his row. The way other passengers had been quietly relocated when he'd boarded. The deference in the crew's voices when they addressed him. Guang Ko, the dragon head. The man who controlled every major smuggling route from Hong Kong to Manila. Whose name made police commissioners sweat and politicians negotiate. Who had built an empire on fear, blood, and absolute control. And yet he couldn't control this. Couldn't make his 10-week-old daughter stop starving. May's cries intensified, becoming hoarse and ragged. The sound clawed at something buried deep in Guang Kao's chest, something he'd thought died the night Li Hua had taken 4 bullets meant for him. Guilt. Helplessness. Terror. "Boss." Chen Wei's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "If she doesn't eat soon." "I know." Guang Ko cut him off, his jaw clenching until his teeth ached. He knew exactly what happened to infants who couldn't keep nutrition down. He'd seen enough death to recognize its approach, even in something so small and innocent. For the first time in 20 years, Guang Ko felt truly powerless. His empire meant nothing at 35,000 feet. His reputation couldn't silence his daughter's suffering. His money couldn't buy what she needed. And then, for rows behind them, someone stood up. Xiaochen had learned to tune out most sounds on airplanes. The hum of engines, the rustle of newspapers, the murmur of conversations, all of it faded into white noise that let her exist in the numb cocoon she'd wrapped around herself since Liang died. But this cry was different. It pierced through her carefully constructed walls like a hot blade through silk. Sharp. Desperate. Familiar in a way that made her chest constrict and her breath catch. She'd heard that exact sound before, in the NICU during her night shifts, when babies fought for survival with everything their tiny bodies possessed. That wasn't hunger. That was starvation. Her body responded before her mind could stop it. A sudden, painful tightening in her breasts, followed by the unmistakable sensation of letdown. She pressed her arms against her chest instinctively, but it was too late. Warmth spread across the nursing pads she still wore, soaking through despite their absorbency. 3 weeks. Her son had been gone for 3 weeks, and her body still hadn't accepted the loss. Still produced milk for a baby who would never drink it. Still woke her in the night with aching fullness that had nowhere to go. The doctors said it would stop eventually. Give it time, they'd said, as if time could heal the amputation of your own heart. The crying continued, escalating to a pitch that made Xiao Chen's hands tremble against the armrests. She knew that progression. Had heard it too many times in premature infants, in babies with feeding difficulties, in children whose bodies were shutting down from lack of nutrition. First came anger, then desperation, then the hoarse, weakening cries that meant the body was giving up. This baby was in the final stage. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but Liang's face materialized behind her eyelids. Those perfect rosebud lips that had nursed so eagerly for 8 precious weeks. The way his tiny hand would rest against her breast while he fed, fingers splaying and curling with contentment. The soft sounds he'd make, satisfied little grunts that had been the soundtrack to the happiest weeks of her life. Then the silence. The terrible, infinite silence when she'd gone to his crib that morning and found him cold and still. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. The crying ahead of her cracked into something more desperate, and Xiaochen felt wetness on her own cheeks. Her milk was leaking, and she was crying, and somewhere on this plane a baby was dying while she sat paralyzed by her own grief. Move, something inside her commanded. You're a nurse. You know what that baby needs. But what that baby needed was impossible. Unthinkable. She couldn't just offer to. The infant's cry weakened, becoming ragged and hoarse. Move. Xiao Chen's hands went to her seatbelt before conscious thought could intervene. Her training overrode her trauma. Her body overrode her fear. 3 weeks ago, she'd sworn she'd never hold another baby. Had convinced herself she couldn't survive feeling that weight in her arms again, couldn't risk the devastation if something went wrong. But this baby didn't have 3 weeks. This baby might not have 3 hours. The flight attendant appeared beside her just as Xiaochen stood, legs shaking beneath her. Miss, are you? I'm a pediatric nurse, Xiaochen heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tears streaming down her face. That baby needs help. The walk down the aisle felt like crossing a battlefield. Every step brought Xiaochen closer to the source of the crying, and closer to the aura of danger that radiated from the man holding the baby. She could feel eyes on her, passengers watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern, as if she were walking toward her own execution. When she reached his row, 2 men in dark suits stood simultaneously, hands moving inside their jackets. Bodyguards. Their eyes were flat, assessing, and she saw her death in them as clearly as if they'd spoken it aloud. Sir, the flight attendant began nervously, this passenger is a nurse. I know what that cry means. Xiaochen's voice cut through the tension, steadier than she felt. She kept her eyes on the baby, not the man. Looking at him directly felt dangerous, like staring down a predator. She's not rejecting the bottle because she's fussy. She's dying. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. One of the bodyguards moved closer, but the man, Guangko, she'd heard the flight attendant whisper his name, raised a hand slightly. The bodyguard froze. Doctors said the formula, his voice was rough, frayed at the edges in a way that suggested this unshakable man was very close to breaking. Formula isn't the problem. Xiaochen finally forced herself to meet his eyes, and the impact nearly made her step back. Dark. Lethal. Drowning in a grief that mirrored her own. She was breastfed, wasn't she? By her mother. Something flickered across his face, pain so raw it was almost obscene to witness. Yes. Then she's rejecting the bottle because it's not what her body knows. not what she associates with safety and survival. Xiao Chen's hands trembled at her sides. In her mind, anything else means death. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the baby's weakening cries. Xiao Chen could see the calculation in Guang Keo's eyes, the way he was processing her words, understanding what she was implying, but not quite believing it. What are you suggesting? Each word was precisely controlled, but violence simmered beneath them. This was insane. This was career-ending, reputation-destroying insanity. But the baby's cries were getting weaker, and Xiao Chen's breasts ached with milk that had nowhere to go, and she was so tired of feeling useless in the face of death. I lost my son 3 weeks ago. The words came out barely above a whisper. My body still produces milk. If she won't take a bottle, then she swallowed hard, forcing the impossible offer past her lips. Then I can feed her, the way her mother would have. The bodyguard's hands moved back inside their jackets. The flight attendant gasped softly. But Guang Keo's eyes never left Xiao Chen's face, and she watched something shift in their depths. Not gratitude, not yet. Something more complex. Recognition, perhaps. Or calculation. Do you understand what you're offering? His voice dropped lower, taking on an edge that made her skin prickle. In my world, the woman who feeds the dragon head's heir becomes. I don't care about your world. Xiao Chen surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. I care that your daughter is starving and I can help her. That's all. But even as she said it, she saw the truth in his eyes. She just offered something that couldn't be taken back. Something that would bind her to this dangerous man in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Guang Ko studied her for a long moment, and Xiao Chen had the distinct impression of being weighed and measured against criteria she couldn't fathom. Then, slowly, he shifted in his seat. Sit, he commanded quietly. And somehow, impossibly, Xiao Chen did. The baby latched within seconds, and the cabin fell into a silence so complete that Xiao Chen could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Mei's desperate cries cut off mid-wail, replaced by soft, urgent suckling sounds that made Xiao Chen's eyes burn with fresh tears. She'd forgotten this. The weight of an infant in her arms. The primal satisfaction of feeding, of providing, of being needed in the most fundamental way a human could be needed. For the first time in 3 weeks, the constant ache in her chest eased slightly, replaced by something almost like purpose. Guang Ko sat rigid beside her, his body angled to shield them from the other passengers' view. His face was unreadable, but she caught the way his hands clenched against his thighs, the muscle ticking in his jaw. He was watching his daughter feed with an intensity that felt almost violent. One of the bodyguards leaned down, speaking rapid Cantonese too quiet for Xiao Chen to catch. But she saw Guang Keo's eyes flicker with something that might have been concern. Or calculation. What? She asked softly, not wanting to disturb Mei's feeding. Nothing that concerns you. His tone was dismissive, but she caught the lie in it. Mei's small hand rested against Xiao Chen's breast, fingers splaying and curling exactly the way Liang's had. The similarity was devastating and healing all at once. She blinked back tears, focusing on the infant's face, no longer purple with distress, but pink and peaceful. What Xiao Chen couldn't know, was that 3 rows back, a passenger with a dragon tattoo coiling up his neck had already sent a text message. 5 words that would ripple through Hong Kong's underworld like a grenade. Dragon Head's heir has dragon mother. By the time the plane landed in Beijing, 7 different triad organizations would know. By nightfall, the news would reach Singapore, Manila, and Macau. By morning, Xiao Chen's face would be identified through airport security footage and distributed to every major criminal network in Southeast Asia. The ancient law was clear, passed down through generations of triad tradition. The woman who nourishes the dragon head's heir becomes sacred, protected, elevated, and most dangerously, bound to the family through ties that could only be severed by death. Qin Wei, Guang Keo's second-in-command, understood this immediately. He caught his boss's eye and saw the grim acknowledgement there. This woman, This stranger who'd acted out of pure compassion had just painted a target on her own back. Every rival family would see her as leverage. Every ambitious lieutenant would see her as opportunity. Every enemy would see her as the key to destroying Guang Kao's empire. "Boss," Chen Wei murmured in Cantonese, "we need to secure her. The moment we land." "I know." Guang Kao's response was clipped, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. Xiao Chen caught the exchange, the sudden tension that rippled through the bodyguards. "What's happening?" "You fed my daughter." Guang Ko finally looked at her directly, and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. "In my world, that means something. Something you cannot undo." "I don't understand." "You will." His voice carried a strange mix of gratitude and regret. "By the time we land, you'll be the most valuable woman in Asia. And the most endangered." Mei finished feeding and let out a small, satisfied sigh against Xiao Chen's chest. The baby's eyes were already drifting closed, her tiny body finally relaxed. It was the most peaceful thing Xiao Chen had witnessed in weeks. She had no idea she'd just started a war. Guang Kao's Hong Kong estate wasn't a home, it was a fortress disguised as luxury. 20-foot walls topped with cameras. Guards at every entrance. Windows made of bulletproof glass that distorted the harbor view into something almost dreamlike. Xiao Chen had been escorted here directly from the Beijing airport, her protests drowned out by Guang Kao's simple, devastating logic. "Mei won't eat without you. You can leave and let her starve, or you can stay and keep her alive." It wasn't really a choice. That had been 4 days ago. 4 days of living in a gilded cage, sleeping in a guest room larger than her entire Shanghai apartment, and feeding Mei every 3 hours like clockwork. 4 days of witnessing a world she'd only seen in movies, men with guns patrolling the grounds, hushed conversations in Cantonese that stopped when she entered rooms, and an underlying current of violence that permeated everything like smoke. But she'd also witnessed something else. Something that didn't fit the monster she'd expected. Late at night, when Mei woke crying, Guan Ko was always there before Xiao Chen could reach the nursery. She'd find him pacing with his daughter against his shoulder, murmuring soft Cantonese words that sounded almost like prayers. His large, scarred hands she'd seen snap a phone in half during an angry call, cradled Mei with a gentleness that seemed impossible. "You don't sleep," Xiao Chen observed one night, finding him in the nursery at 3 in the morning. "Sleep is a luxury I lost 10 weeks ago." He didn't turn around, just kept swaying gently with Mei. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Li Hua falling. Hear the gunshots. Watch her bleed out while begging me to save our daughter." The rawness in his voice stripped away every defense Xiao Chen had built. She moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion carved into his face, the gray threading through his hair that probably hadn't been there 3 months ago. "I see Liang in his crib," she whispered. "Still and cold. I check his breathing in my dreams, over and over, and every time he's already gone." Their eyes met in the dim nursery light, and something wordless passed between them. Recognition. 2 people shattered by loss, held together only by their desperate need to keep this one small life breathing. "The doctors said it wasn't your fault," Guang Ko said quietly. "SIDS. No one could have prevented it. And the bullets were meant for you, not Li Hua." Xiao Chen's response was equally soft. "But we both carry the weight anyway, don't we?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he'd retreat behind his walls. Instead, he did something that shocked her. He held out Mei, offering his daughter to her. "She needs to eat. And I need to trust someone. I'm not good at the second part." Xiao Chen took Mei, feeling the baby's warmth against her chest. "I'm not good at the first part anymore. Being needed. I was convinced I'd failed at it forever. Then maybe we're both wrong." Guang Ko settled into the chair across from her, watching as she began to feed his daughter. "Maybe we're exactly what we need to be." Outside, guards changed shifts. Security cameras swept the grounds. The machinery of his empire continued its ruthless grinding. But inside this small nursery, Two broken people sat in companionable silence, held together by a baby who needed them both to survive. Grief recognizing grief. Strength recognizing strength. And something more dangerous beginning to bloom between them, something that would either save them or destroy them completely. On the seventh morning, Guang Ko found Xiaochen on the terrace overlooking Victoria Harbor. Mei slept peacefully in her arms, finally gaining the weight she'd lost in those desperate early weeks. The baby's cheeks had filled out, her skin glowing with health that hadn't been there on the plane. Today is the day. His voice came from behind her, rough as gravel. You need to decide. Xiaochen had known this was coming. 7 days, he'd said when they'd arrived. 7 days to choose between a life she could never explain and a freedom that would haunt her forever. She didn't turn around, just kept watching the boats cut across the harbor, their wakes disappearing almost as soon as they formed. Qinwei prepared everything, Guang Ko continued, moving to stand beside her. New identity. Bank account in Singapore with enough money that you'd never need to work again. Papers to get you anywhere in the world. He paused. Mei is eating formula now. Transitioning. She doesn't need you anymore. The lie sat heavy between them. They both knew Mei still reached for Xiaochen instinctively, still calmed only when she heard her voice, still fed best from her breast despite accepting bottles when desperate. The baby had imprinted on her in a way that went beyond nutrition. I spoke to my mother yesterday. Xiaochen's voice was quiet. Told her I was taking time away. She asked if I was healing. She finally looked at Guang Ko, finding his dark eyes already fixed on her face. I told her I didn't know yet. And now? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. They both understood what he was really asking. Stay or go. Safety or danger. The known grief or the unknown future. Xiaochen looked down at Mei, studying the baby's peaceful face. In 7 days, this child had become her reason to wake up, her purpose, her healing. But it was more than that, and she'd be lying to herself if she didn't admit it. It was also the man standing beside her. The way he'd held her when she'd broken down crying on the third night, sobbing for Liang until she couldn't breathe. The way he'd made sure she ate, even when grief stole her appetite. The way he looked at her across the nursery at 3 in the morning, like she was something precious he was terrified to break. Your world terrifies me, she said honestly. Yesterday, I watched you interrogate a man who'd betrayed you. I saw what you're capable of. The violence. The ruthlessness. And that's your answer. His voice had gone flat, carefully emotionless. I'm not finished. She adjusted Mei in her arms. I also saw you singing to your daughter in Cantonese. Saw you reading her bedtime stories even though she's too young to understand. Saw you checking on me in the middle of the night to make sure I was eating, sleeping, surviving. She took a breath. I saw the man behind the monster. Guang Ko's hands clenched at his sides. If you stay, there's no going back. Every enemy I have will want you dead or captured. Every day will carry risk. The Dragon Mother tradition, it's not just a title. It's a target. I know. You'll be bound to me. To Mei. To this life. I know. Then why? His voice cracked slightly, the first real break in his control she'd witnessed. Why would you choose this? Xiaochen turned to face him fully, Mei warm and alive against her chest. Because for the first time in 3 weeks, I don't want to die. Because your daughter needs me. Because she hesitated, then pushed forward. Because you look at me like I'm not broken. Like I'm exactly what I'm supposed to be. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to name. Guang Ko reached out slowly, his scarred fingers brushing against Mei's tiny hand. The baby stirred, curling her fingers around his thumb. 7 days isn't enough, he said quietly. To fall this hard. No, Xiaochen agreed, her heart hammering against her ribs. It's not. So you'll stay. The vulnerability in his voice was devastating. Even knowing what it costs? She thought of the life Qinwei had prepared for her. Safety. Anonymity. Freedom. Then she looked at the baby in her arms and the man beside her, both of them watching her like she held their entire world in her hands. "I'll stay." It happened in the smallest moments, the falling. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the quiet spaces between feeding Mei and surviving another day. Guang Keo's hand lingering on Xiao Chen's lower back as he guided her through the estate. The way he'd started leaving jasmine tea by her bedside each morning, remembering she'd mentioned it once in passing. How he'd demolished a business associate who'd spoken disrespectfully about her in Cantonese, not realizing she'd been learning the language in secret. And Xiaochen, she fell in the way he held Mei during her baths, supporting her tiny head with infinite care. In his rare, devastating smiles that transformed his face from dangerous to breathtaking. In the nights, he'd find her crying and simply sit beside her, not trying to fix her grief, but bearing witness to it. "This is dangerous," she whispered one night as they stood together in the nursery, Mei asleep between them in her crib. "What we're becoming." "I know." Guang Keo's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining. "My enemies will use it. You. They'll see you as my greatest weakness." "Are they wrong?" He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. "No. They're not wrong at all." His free hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "You've become the most dangerous thing in my world, Xiaochen. Not because of what you can do to me, but because of what I'd do for you." The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable. Desperate. Like two people drowning who'd finally found air. His hands tangled in her hair, hers clutched at his shoulders, and for a moment the violence of his world and the grief of hers all fell away, leaving only this connection, need, the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone matter. What they didn't know was that across the harbor, in a penthouse owned by the Sun Eon Triad, photographs were being studied with predatory interest. Surveillance footage from the estate, captured by a guard who'd been on their payroll for months. Images of Guang Ko and Xiaochen together, touching, talking, looking at each other with an intimacy that screamed weakness. Wei Huang, the Sun Eon's dragon head, smiled as he studied the photos. For 15 years, he'd been waiting for Guang Ko to show vulnerability. The man was untouchable, ruthless, with no pressure points except his empire itself. Trying to attack him directly was suicide. He'd proven that by surviving 4 assassination attempts without breaking a sweat. But this woman? This nurse who'd appeared from nowhere and somehow become essential to both Guang Keo's daughter and his heart? She was different. She was soft. Unprotected by the layers of violence and paranoia that shielded Guang Ko himself. "When do we move?" his lieutenant asked, leaning over the photographs. "Soon." Wei Huang tapped the image of Xiaochen holding Mei. "But we don't just take the woman. We take both of them, the heir and the dragon mother. Make him choose between his empire and his new family." His smile widened. "Watch the great Guang Ko finally break." Back at the estate, Guang Ko pulled away from the kiss, resting his forehead against Xiaochen's. "If you stay, truly stay, I can't promise to keep you safe. My world will try to destroy you. Then we'll survive it together." Her voice was steady, certain. "I didn't come this far just to run when things get difficult. Xiaochen, I love you." The words came out fierce, unplanned. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you and Mei, and I'm not going anywhere." The vulnerability that crossed his face was devastating. "I haven't said those words since Li Hua died. Thought I never would again." "Then don't say them." She kissed him softly. "Show me instead." He did. Through the night, through whispered promises and desperate touches, through the way he held her like she was both salvation and damnation wrapped in one impossible package. Neither of them heard the guard's footsteps as he passed by the nursery, phone in hand, sending final confirmation to the Sun Eon. The trap was set. The war was coming. And love, in the underworld, had just become the deadliest weapon of all. The explosion came at dawn, shattering the illusion of safety in a wall of fire and screaming metal. Xiaochen jolted awake as the entire estate shook, Mei's terrified wails cutting through the chaos before Xiaochen's mind could even process what was happening. She lunged for the nursery, her training overriding panic, but the door burst open before she reached it. Guangko, already dressed and armed, thrust Mei into her arms with an urgency that made her blood run cold. Safe room. Now. His voice was deadly calm, but his eyes held something she'd never seen before. Fear. Qinwei will. The second explosion threw them both to the floor. Xiaochen curled around Mei instinctively, protecting the baby's body with her own as plaster rained down from the ceiling. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard gunfire, automatic weapons, close and getting closer. Guangko hauled her up, half dragging her toward the hallway. His men were already moving, a choreographed response to an assault they'd clearly drilled for. But there were too many attackers. She could hear them breaching from multiple entry points, systematic and precise. The west wall is compromised. Qinwei's voice crackled over the radio. Boss, they're inside. More gunfire. Closer now. Guangko shoved Xiaochen behind him, his weapon coming up smoothly as three men in tactical gear rounded the corner. The violence was clinical efficient. 3 shots, 3 bodies falling. But Xiaochen barely registered it over Mei's screaming. The safe room, she started. Compromised. Guangko's jaw was tight as he reloaded. They knew the layout. Knew exactly where to hit us. The implication hung heavy between them. Betrayal from within. They moved through the estate like ghosts, Guangko clearing corners while Xiaochen clutched Mei against her chest. The baby's cries had weakened to terrified whimpers that broke something fundamental inside her. This child had already lost her mother to violence. She couldn't lose everything else. They almost made it to the garage. Almost. The attack came from behind, from one of Guangko's own guards, the one who'd been with them since Beijing. Xiaochen saw the recognition flash across Guangko's face, saw the betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could. But he was turning, bringing his weapon up, and time seemed to slow. Then Qinwei appeared, stepping between them and the traitor. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Qinwei dropped, blood blooming across his chest, but his sacrifice bought Guangko the seconds he needed. The traitor fell. But more were coming. She could hear them converging, cutting off their escape routes with military precision. Go! Qinwei gasped from the floor, blood bubbling at his lips. East exit, there's still a chance. Guangko hesitated for a heartbeat, and that hesitation cost them everything. The tranquilizer dart hit Xiaochen in the neck before she even saw the shooter. The world tilted, Mei's weight suddenly impossibly heavy in her arms. She felt Guangko catch her, heard him roaring orders, but everything was getting distant and fuzzy. Strong hands were prying Mei from her grasp. She tried to fight, tried to hold on, but her body wasn't responding. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Guangko on his knees, surrounded by Sun Yian soldiers, watching helplessly as they carried his daughter and the woman he loved into the smoke. When Xiaochen woke, she was in a concrete room with no windows. Mei was crying in her arms, hungry and terrified. And on the wall across from her, someone had painted a message in red. Your empire or their lives. You have 24 hours. Guangko stood at the entrance to the Sun Yian stronghold with empty hands and a USB drive containing everything that made him untouchable: account numbers, trafficking routes, blackmail material on half of Asia's political elite, the locations of every safe house and weapons cache. 15 years of empire building, reduced to 16 gigabytes. Wei Huang smiled from across the warehouse floor, flanked by 30 armed men. The great dragon head, brought to his knees by a woman and a baby. Your father would be ashamed. My father is dead because he valued pride over family. Guangko's voice was steady, empty of the rage burning through his veins. I won't make the same mistake. Show me the drive. Guangko held it up, letting the light catch the metal. Everything you need to dismantle my organization. In exchange, you let them walk out of here unharmed. And you? I stay. You do whatever you want with me. His eyes found the room where he knew they were holding Xiaochen and Mei. But they leave. Now. Wei Huang laughed, gesturing to his men. Bring them out. Let him see what he's trading his empire for. The door opened, and Xiaochen emerged. Mei clutched against her chest. Her clothes were torn, a bruise darkening her cheekbone, but her eyes were fierce, unbroken. When she saw Guangko standing there, offering to trade his life for theirs, something shifted in her expression. No. Her voice rang clear across the warehouse. No, you don't get to do this. Xiaochen. I didn't survive losing Liang just to watch you die for us. She was walking toward him now, even with guns trained on her back. I didn't fall in love with you so you could martyr yourself and leave Mei without a father. There's no other way. There's always another way. She reached him, Mei between them like a bridge. You taught me that. When I wanted to give up, when I thought I was too broken to matter, you showed me that strength isn't about standing alone. It's about choosing what's worth fighting for. Wei Huang's smile faded. Touching. But the deal stands. The Empire or your lives. Xiaochen turned to face him, and Guangko saw something in her he'd never witnessed before. Not the gentle nurse or the grieving mother, but something forged in fire, a woman who'd lost everything and refused to lose anything ever again. Then take the Empire, she said clearly. Take his routes, his accounts, his reputation. But you're not taking our family. In that moment, Guangko understood. She wasn't asking him to fight. She was asking him to choose. And for the first time in his life, the choice was simple. He dropped the USB drive at Wei Huang's feet. You want my empire? Take it. It's built on blood and fear and bones. It poisoned my marriage, killed the woman I loved, and almost cost me my daughter. He moved to stand beside Xiaochen, his hand finding hers. I'm done building kingdoms. I'd rather build a family. The warehouse fell silent. Wei Huang stared at the drive like it was a trick, a trap. You're just giving up? I'm choosing differently. Guangko looked at Xiaochen, at Mei's tiny hand curled against her mother's chest. My father told me once that the truest power is knowing what you can't afford to lose. I thought he meant the Empire. I was wrong. Wei Huang picked up the drive, suspicion warring with greed in his eyes. You walk out of here, you're nothing. No protection. No power. Every enemy you've made will come for you. Then they'll have to come through both of us, Xiaochen said quietly, squeezing Guangko's hand. And somehow, impossibly, Wei Huang laughed, a genuine sound of disbelief and reluctant respect. You're either the wisest man I've ever met or the biggest fool. He waved his hand. Go. Before I change my mind. They walked out together, Guangko and Xiaochen and Mei, leaving the Empire behind like ashes. Outside, dawn was breaking over Hong Kong, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. What now? Xiaochen asked as they stood in the empty street. Guangko pulled them both close, his lips brushing her temple. Now we disappear. Start over. Be the family we both thought we'd lost. Xiaochen closed her eyes, feeling Mei's heartbeat against her chest and Guangko's arms around them both. She wasn't the woman who'd buried her son 3 weeks ago, convinced she was too broken to ever love again. She was the woman who'd walked into hell and fought her way back out. The woman who'd chosen love over safety, family over empire. The woman who'd finally, impossibly, found her way home.